You hear them before you see them, the slow, echoing shuffle of boots across polished stone, a rhythm that has marked your life for years. You carry a tray of bread and milk, but you know it is not nourishment you bring. It is silence. It is secrecy. It is complicity. The Palace of Vienna in 1793 glitters with chandeliers and painted ceilings, yet you walk not toward its golden halls, but down a side corridor that smells of damp mortar and extinguished candles. Few servants go this way. Fewer still return with their consciences intact. At the end of the passage lies a door, plain, unadorned, utterly out of place in a palace built for emperors. Behind it, a life unfolds in shadows. They call him Ferdinand, though you have never dared say the name aloud. He is 7 years old, though he doesn't know it. Time means little here, where days blur into one another, marked only by bowls of cold porridge and the brief appearance of attendants who avoid his eyes. You open the door. The child looks up. His eyes, almond-shaped, bright, searching, catch the sliver of dawn breaking through a narrow slit of a window. Dust motes swirl in the light, and he follows them with a joy that breaks your heart. The world has given him nothing but this room, these shadows, and yet he still laughs softly when the dust dances just right.
You set down the tray. He reaches for it, not clumsy, but careful, deliberate, as if aware that every movement must count. You long to speak to him, to whisper some word of comfort, but you know the rules. No conversation, no affection. He must remain forgotten. His very existence is considered a danger, not because of who he is, but because of what he represents. Outside, the imperial family rehearses their perfection. His cousins practice Latin declensions, their handwriting neat as calligraphy. Tutors drill them in philosophy, music, diplomacy. They are being polished into instruments of power, tokens in dynastic games that span continents. But this boy, this child born different, is a crack in the marble, a flaw in the divine facade. To acknowledge him would be to admit that royal blood is as fragile, as fallible as any other. You close the door and step back into silence. Yet even as you retreat, you hear it, a humming, off-key, innocent. A tune repeated again and again, the only rebellion left to him. For a moment you pause, your hand pressed to the cold stone wall, listening. It is the sound of a child insisting, however faintly, that he exists. History will not remember him. The records will call him stillborn or weak, or never mention him at all. But you, a servant with nothing but your memory, will carry this truth, that behind the palace's gilded facade, the empire hides its most fragile heirs in rooms without names.
And he is not the only one. Across Europe, from London's mist to Madrid's heat, from the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg to the marble halls of Florence, children like him are born, royal children with faces that did not match the ideal, with minds that wandered differently, children who were locked away, erased from portraits, their names scratched out of genealogies. This is their story. Not of thrones gained or crowns lost, but of lives hidden, laughter suppressed, and humanity denied. Forgotten princes and princesses, who remind us that power fears difference more than it fears death. In the glittering courts of Europe, where ceilings blazed with painted heavens and corridors echoed with the click of polished boots, power was meant to look flawless. A dynasty was not just a family. It was a myth sculpted in flesh and blood, every child a promise of divine order. And yet, within these carefully choreographed households, nature sometimes wrote a different script. What we now call Down syndrome, a genetic condition caused by an extra copy of chromosome 21, was then unnameable. No physician in the 18th century spoke of chromosomes. No court tutor knew the language of genetics. Instead, such children were described in whispers: cursed, bewitched, a punishment from heaven, a living omen that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Their almond-shaped eyes, their gentle smiles, their slower steps, all became symbols of disgrace in a society obsessed with the illusion of purity. For the peasants in the fields, life carried different rules. A farmer's daughter born with Down syndrome might still learn to sweep the cottage floor, to carry eggs from the hen house, to laugh at the clucking of chickens in the yard. In such households, difference was folded into survival. Imperfect, perhaps, but accepted as part of God's will. Life, after all, demanded pragmatism.
But royalty could not afford such acceptance. Every prince was a pawn in marriage negotiations that bound kingdoms. Every princess was a vessel for alliances, treaties, inheritances. A child who could not learn etiquette, who could not remember the steps of a formal dance, who might fumble at the dinner table or fail to recite a line of scripture at court, it was unthinkable. They were living cracks in the marble of monarchy, and cracks had to be hidden, or the entire facade might crumble. So the palaces built their own shadows. Behind velvet curtains and gilded doors, quiet rooms became prisons. Servants were instructed not to speak, nurses told to love without leaving traces, physicians ordered to write lies in their ledgers. The official portraits always showed perfection, but just out of frame were children whose very existence was considered too dangerous to admit. To the outside world, royal blood was the very proof of superiority, the visible sign of God's favor. But what if royal blood produced a child who was slower, softer, different? That question threatened to collapse the entire edifice of divine right. For centuries, monarchies justified their power by claiming their lineage was chosen, set apart, almost holy. A disabled child was not just a personal tragedy, it was political heresy. And so the pattern repeated itself across centuries and borders. A baby born with features that did not fit the family's myth, hidden away. A prince who could not master languages, declared dead in infancy. A princess who smiled too freely, who wandered too innocently, erased from records, her name scratched out as though she had never lived. Doctors, too, became accomplices. Before John Langdon Down first described the condition in 1866, physicians used vague, cruel words: idiot, mongoloid, imbecile. They prescribed silence, concealment, institutionalization. Royal courts embraced those recommendations eagerly. To them, it was not medicine, but strategy, a way to protect dynasties from scandal, to preserve the fiction that their blood was untainted. But the truth was always harder to erase. A grandmother might write of a poor little one in a private letter. A midwife might confide her guilt in a secret diary. A servant decades later might recall the sound of laughter echoing from a walled-off corridor. These fragments, letters, receipts, servant testimonies are all that remain of lives once carefully hidden. They are faint, but they persist, haunting the archives of Europe like ghosts that refuse to be silenced. And so we are left with a paradox. These children, born to families whose every action was chronicled, are today among history's least recorded. Their absence is itself a kind of presence, a shadow that reveals the lengths to which power will go to deny imperfection. This is not only a medical story, nor merely a series of tragedies. It is a mirror held up to monarchy itself. For in the fate of these forgotten children, we see the central fear of dynasties across the centuries, that power built on blood is fragile, and that love, simple, ordinary, unconditional, has always been the greater strength.
England, The Lost Prince, Prince John, 1905 to 1919. In the manicured gardens of Sandringham, a boy once chased acorns with a joy that seemed to belong to another world. His name was John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. At first, he appeared in family portraits, a sailor suit on his tiny frame, his hand clasped with his siblings. But by the time he was 4, seizures had begun to twist his body, and his laughter came tinged with what physicians delicately called learning difficulties. By 1909, he had vanished from view. Visitors to the royal court never asked about him. Servants spoke in whispers of Wood Farm, the cottage where he lived in seclusion. His nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill, remained by his side, preserving drawings and toys that told a different story, not of tragedy, but of innocence. When John died at 13 after a final seizure, Queen Mary wrote of release and mercy. Yet for Lala, it was not release at all, but the extinguishing of a boy who loved birdsong, who laughed at games only he understood. His official absence became complete, but his quiet existence lingers in the margins of letters, in the few photographs that survived.
Prussia, The Burned Portraits, 1889 to 1906. Prince Waldemar, nephew to Wilhelm II, lived quietly, unseen. His nurse, Emma Mueller, could not bear the silence. Each year, she paid an artist to paint the boy, 17 portraits in total. They showed him growing, maturing, his features rendered with dignity. When Waldemar died, Emma tried to give the portraits to his mother. They were burned in front of her eyes. She spent the rest of her life writing letters to newspapers, begging the world to remember. None published her words. After her death, the letters revealed a boy who loved trains, who knew every bird by song, who memorized entire symphonies after a single hearing. He was not less than, she wrote. He was simply different. Italy, A Life Half Shown, 1879 to 1912. Princess Giovanna of Savoy was neither erased nor acknowledged. The family chose a middle path. She appeared briefly at public ceremonies, carefully coached to wave, to smile, then withdrawn. Behind palace walls, she lived more freely, surrounded by tutors who discovered her extraordinary memory for music, her uncanny ability to calm animals, her joy in repetition. She died at 33, her funeral quiet but dignified. Her uncle is said to have remarked, "She lived as God made her, and that was enough." It was a rare mercy in an age of concealment.
Belgium, The Walled Room, 1864. Leopold II, infamous for cruelty in the Congo, showed none toward his own blood. A daughter born with disabilities was hidden in the palace, her chamber eventually bricked shut. Servants later spoke of hearing a child's voice through the wall, singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One maid, Marie Delacroix, risked her position to slip food and toys through a gap. The child, she said, returned drawings in berry juice, handprints surrounded by hearts, and one attempt at the word mama. When shown decades later, the crude image said more than any official record. Love persisted, even when denied air or sunlight. Romania, The Angel Child, 1893 to 1900. When Crown Prince Carol's son was born, he was declared dead within hours. But Queen Elizabeth, poet, mystic, known as Carmen Silva, kept journals filled with cryptic references to a star child. Monastic records from the same period speak of a special child of God, supported by anonymous donations. For 7 years, the boy lived under the care of monks, given music, paint, kindness. Then the payment stopped. The record ends. Queen Elizabeth's journals mourn an angel recalled to heaven. Whether literal or coded, the truth is clear. He lived, and he was loved in secret.
Luxembourg, A Crack in the Silence, 1957. By the late 20th century, medicine had changed, but silence lingered. When Prince Jean of Luxembourg was born with Down syndrome, the family did something revolutionary. They admitted it. He lived in a care facility, spoken of discreetly, but not denied. It was not full acceptance, but it was a crack in centuries of denial. For the first time, a European royal child with Down syndrome was not erased, but acknowledged, even if cautiously.
Other whispers, Greece, Netherlands, Norway. Scattered across Europe, fragments remain. A Greek princess hidden in exile, her life threatened by the rise of fascism. A Dutch farmer's family raising a mysterious child with uncanny resemblance to Wilhelmina. A Norwegian princess officially dead after 3 days, but cared for in a Swiss sanatorium for 8 years. Each story ends the same. Absence in the record, presence only in memory.
France, the Forgotten Infant. Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, 1640. Paris celebrated the birth of the Dauphin, the future Sun King, but there was another child, a frail brother who lived only 43 days. Court records dismissed him as weak, unfit to thrive. Yet letters, uncovered centuries later, tell of features we now recognize: the flat bridge of the nose, the protruding tongue, the single crease across the palm. The queen prayed in private chapels, commissioned pilgrimages to distant shrines. Some whispered of her Spanish blood, others of her husband's sins. Blame swirled like incense, searching for a culprit where nature had simply made variation. The infant's nurse was interrogated again and again, as if neglect could explain a broken heart. He left behind no name, no portrait, only the faintest shadow in the chronicles of Versailles. A royal child erased before his life had even begun.
Russia, the vanishing Grand Duchess. Romanovs, late 19th century. The Alexander Palace glittered with chandeliers, but in its east wing, a different story unfolded. Payroll records tell of a special nursery that received supplies for 16 years, long after the supposed death of an infant daughter of Grand Duke Vladimir. Servants whispered of a girl who never mastered speech, who wandered snowy gardens in her nightgown, laughing at the falling flakes. When revolution tore Russia apart, the Romanovs vanished into legend and execution. And with them, this unnamed daughter disappeared without trace. Was she abandoned, spirited away, or silenced in the chaos? History offers only silence. Yet in that silence, we glimpse a tragedy compounded, not just the loss of a life, but the deliberate burial of memory itself. Spain, the Habsburg curse. The Spanish Habsburgs, infamous for their inbreeding, left behind more than portraits of kings with jutting jaws. Hidden in coded Latin, court physicians recorded children with Mongol features, their existence denied in public while catalogued in private. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, dared to suggest that these children were not cursed, but examples of God's mysterious variety. For this heresy, he was silenced by the Inquisition, his writings hidden in a hollow book. Centuries later, when his notes were discovered, they told of a princess who embraced every servant she met, who danced without rhythm but with uncontainable joy. Burned by fire, buried by shame, her story survives only because one man refused to forget.
Ottoman Empire, the Prince of the Cage. The Ottoman succession laws were brutal. Only strength survived. For a prince born with a mind that wandered differently, weakness meant death. But one boy, born in the reign of Mehmed III, was spared, not killed. He was sent to the Caves, the cage, a palace within a palace, where potential heirs lived in gilded captivity. For 23 years, supplies were delivered to a single locked chamber. Guards spoke of strange noises. Songs hummed endlessly, laughter at odd hours. When the cage was finally opened during a succession crisis, they found him surrounded by thousands of shards of colored glass arranged in patterns across the floor. For decades, he had made art no one would ever see, sung songs no one would ever hear. Then the records fall silent. One entry ends with chilling brevity: the chamber emptied. Whether he lived, died, or was erased entirely,
history does not say. But in that chamber, for 2 decades, he had built a kingdom of light from broken fragments.
Bavaria, the quiet wing. At Nymphenburg Palace, visitors admired Baroque gardens, never knowing that in the quiet wing, a princess lived unseen. Alexandra, born in 1826, was officially declared dead at 3. Yet diaries of her governess reveal lessons continued for decades, teaching her to dress herself, to hold a spoon, to recognize letters, though never form words. The governess wrote tenderly of Alexandra's devotion to her canaries, how she would sit for hours listening to their songs, smiling at the music, as if it were composed just for her. And yet, when she finally died at 25, no ceremony marked her passing. The palace erased her as carefully as it had hidden her. Portugal, the unpaintable princess, 1734 to 1745. In Lisbon, bells rang for the birth of Infanta Maria Francisca, daughter of King John V. As was custom, an artist was summoned to immortalize the newborn in oils. Yet the painter left the court in haste, his sketches burned, the commission unpaid. Years later, on his deathbed, he confessed, "How do you paint innocence itself, when innocence is not what power demands?" Hidden in the convent of Santos, Maria grew under the care of nuns. They recorded a child who folded altar cloths with care, who sang prayers she could never fully remember, who delighted in feeding chickens in the courtyard. When fever took her at 11, the sisters pleaded to bury her among them. Permission was granted, perhaps eagerly. Her grave bears no royal title, only 3 words: God's child, anonymous. Denmark, the prince who saw patterns, 1803 to 1834. Prince Gustav was born into the Danish royal family, but his life became a theater of illusions. Officially, he suffered from a nervous condition requiring endless travel. In truth, he was shuttled between remote estates, kept out of sight. Tutors filed reports of progress in Latin and mathematics, but in private letters they described something else entirely. One, Hans Eriksson, wrote of the prince's uncanny memory for faces, his ability to sense storms days before they broke, his strange instinct for detecting lies. Perhaps it is we, Eriksson reflected, who are blind, measuring intelligence only by what we understand. But such words found no sympathy at court. Gustav died young, of a weak heart, his return to Denmark carried out in secret at night, his life compressed into a single false line of genealogy. Sweden, the ghost in the garden, 1852 to 1861, ? In Stockholm, official records state that Prince Carlos, nephew to the Bernadotte line, died at 3 months. Yet whispers persisted. A groundskeeper's son, writing decades later, remembered a boy who laughed constantly, who crouched for hours transfixed by ant colonies. The boy could not speak, but feared nothing, smiled at everyone. The memoir recalls him appearing only when the royal family was absent, vanishing days before their return. He was like a ghost, the old man wrote, but the happiest ghost I ever knew. Austria-Hungary, Felix of the Monastery, 1868 to 1880. Archduke Karl Ludwig's son was declared stillborn, but a midwife's diary tells a different tale. The child lived, his features prompting revulsion from the emperor. He was taken at once, his mother told only that he had died. Years later, the same midwife encountered him again, alive, in a monastery, raised as an orphan named Felix. There, monks described him as radiant, helpful, beloved. He fed chickens, carried buckets, laughed at bells ringing through stone cloisters. When scarlet fever carried him off at 12, the abbot wrote, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could."
Patterns emerge again and again like cracks beneath gilded paint. Whether in London or Lisbon, Vienna or St. Petersburg, the stories repeat with uncanny rhythm. A child is born, the difference noticed, the whispers begin. Then comes the decision, not of medicine, not of love, but of power, to hide, to erase, to silence. It is tempting to think these were isolated tragedies, footnotes in vast dynastic chronicles. Yet when the fragments are laid side by side, the diaries, the payrolls, the servant testimonies, they form something larger, a chorus of silence echoing across centuries. It is not just the children who were hidden, it was an entire aspect of humanity systematically erased from the record, as if compassion itself were an embarrassment. Why such fear? Because monarchy rested on a fragile illusion that blood could be perfect, chosen, divine. Every christening, every portrait, every royal wedding reinforced this myth. A disabled child was more than a private sorrow, it was the theological scandal. If kings were appointed by God, what did it mean when their sons were born with what society called defects? Was God mocking them? Was divine favor withdrawn?
The answer monarchs found was not acceptance, but denial. Better to erase a name from the genealogy than allow it to unravel the entire edifice of divine right. Better to wall up a room, to bury a child in anonymity, to bribe servants into silence, than to admit that blue blood ran no purer than any peasant's vein. And yet, amid all this concealment, flickers of humanity survived. A nurse who kept drawings, a governess who wrote of her pupils' love for canaries, a monk who named a boy Felix, happy because he radiated joy even in exile. These small acts of tenderness stand out all the more sharply against the cruelty that surrounded them. They remind us that the great crime was not the children's difference, but society's inability to see value in it. The language of the time reveals the mindset. Doctors spoke of idiots, imbeciles, mongoloids, terms meant not to describe but to dismiss. Royal correspondents used words like release and mercy when children died, as though death itself were a kindness compared to life lived outside dynastic utility. Mercy in their mouths was a mask for relief.
This is the paradox of monarchy: immense wealth in privilege, yet impoverished in compassion. The children who might have brought lessons of patience, of joy in simplicity, of love unmeasured by achievement, were instead cast as threats. Their very presence undermined the myth of superiority, and myths, once cracked, cannot be mended. For modern audiences, these stories strike a different chord. Today, we know that Down syndrome is simply a genetic variation, 1 in 700 births. We know individuals with Down syndrome can live long, meaningful lives. We know they laugh, cry, love, dream, create. But centuries of monarchy refused to know this. They could not afford to. In hiding their children, the royals also hid themselves. From tenderness, from truth, parents learned to fear their own offspring. Siblings grew up believing in their absolute genetic superiority, never given the chance to see difference as humanity rather than shame. Dynasties, in protecting their facade, hollowed out their souls. And yet, it would be naive to place all blame solely on royalty. They were, in part, reflections of their societies. For centuries, disability was met with superstition, cruelty, neglect. Institutions warehoused those deemed unfit. Physicians advised silence. Monarchies simply carried those prejudices to their logical, ruthless extreme. But their power made their choices heavier, their responsibility greater. By presenting themselves as models of God's perfection, they amplified society's prejudice, legitimized shame, and ensured that difference remained unspeakable.
The hidden children thus became mirrors, not of their own deficiency, but of the moral failures of the systems that denied them. They remind us that power, when obsessed with appearances, cannot tolerate humanity's variety. That shame, when institutionalized, corrodes not just the individual, but entire generations.
Even in the 20th century, old habits died hard. As medical science advanced, royal families grew more discreet, but no more accepting. Private institutions replaced convents. Discreet trust funds replaced whispered stipends. Secrecy continued, modernized for an era of public scrutiny. The logic remained, better absence than imperfection. But absence leaves its own scars. Every bricked-up room, every erased name, every unmarked grave speaks louder now than any royal proclamation once did. They testify to fear masquerading as strength, to cruelty disguised as duty. They force us to ask, what is the true defect here? The extra chromosome or the missing compassion? In the end, these stories tell us less about genetics than about power itself. Power built on illusion cannot tolerate difference. Power rooted in myth cannot survive the truth that all blood is mortal, all families imperfect. And so power turns against its own, sacrificing love for image, children for legacy. Yet the fragments that survive, the drawings in berry juice, the portraits burned in vain, the diary entries written in tenderness, prove that humanity cannot be erased so easily. Against the silence of kings, servants, nurses, and monks whispered another truth. These children lived, they laughed, they mattered. And in remembering them, we reclaim not only their existence, but a piece of our own humanity long denied.
The corridors are empty now. The footsteps that once echoed have faded into centuries of silence. Dust still gathers in forgotten rooms. Sunlight still filters through narrow slits of stone. Somewhere in those shadows, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The faint laughter of a child who should have been remembered. Perhaps his name was Ferdinand, or Maria, or Jean, or Alexandra. Perhaps it was one of the dozens of names erased from genealogies, their letters scratched away as though silence could undo existence. Yet names, once spoken, are never entirely gone. Even if whispered only by servants in kitchens, by nuns in convents, by nurses who carried drawings in secret trunks, the names remain, alive in fragments. Picture the maid in Brussels slipping toys through a wall to a girl no one else acknowledged. Picture the midwife who recognized a stillborn infant years later in a monastery, alive, renamed Felix, loved by monks. Picture the nurse who commissioned 17 portraits of a prince knowing they might all be destroyed, yet refusing to let him disappear without witness. Each of these small acts was defiance. Each was love smuggled into a world that preferred absence.
The royals who hid their children thought they were protecting their dynasties, sealing cracks in marble. But history sees differently. What endures is not the illusion of perfection, but the cruelty of its enforcement. What we remember now are not only the crowns and coronations, but the shadows. The rooms where children hummed songs no one would hear, arranged patterns no one would see, dreamed lives they were never allowed to live. And in this way, those hidden princes and princesses did not vanish entirely. Their existence, denied in life, lingers as haunting in death. They remind us that power without compassion corrodes itself, that shame, passed down like inheritance, costs more than any throne ever gained. That the measure of civilization lies not in jewels or ceremonies, but in how it treats its most fragile members. So return, once more, to that forgotten chamber in Vienna. The servant sets down the tray. The child reaches for it. Dust spins in the shaft of dawn. He hums a tune, broken, imperfect, beautiful. No court scribe will record it. No genealogy will mark his life. But the melody lingers, carried forward by memory, by defiance, by the stubborn persistence of truth. And now, centuries later, we hear it. We tell his story.
We say his name. That is enough. Not enough to undo the silence, not enough to heal the cruelty, but enough to remember that he lived, enough to refuse the erasure, enough to ensure that when history tries to bury its inconvenient children, the earth itself will whisper back, "They were here."